Let's just begin with a question before we jump into this week's teaching. What is it that you are trying to fix in your life at the moment? Is there anything that you are trying desperately to get working? It might be a physical thing, like last week we thought about property and ownership. It might be a relational thing, which we'll think about next week, like a marriage or a parenting issue or a work issue. But what is it that you're trying to get to work right now in your life? Because today we're going to think about how when we want to get something to work, when we want to put something to work, when we want to fix something, it can be one of the key things that means that we're invited but distracted by it. It can be one of the things that keeps us from taking care of ourselves in order to actually take care of others. In fact, I would say this. Sometimes what we're trying so hard to get working, to put right, to fix, the thing that we're trying to get to work doesn't work because we're not doing something that we need to do first. And that's what we're going to think about this morning. Well, last week we began a new 3-part series entitled Invited but Distracted. For those who weren't here, or for those of you that were here but got distracted, we were unpacking a story that Jesus told to warn the Jewish believers then and us now that while there are many ways to live life and many ways to benefit others in the process, there is also a potential problem. There is a problem when the key components of life become a distraction and keep us from responding to God's invitation, which keep us from responding to God's goodness. So here's the story. A house owner sends out invitations to lots of people to come for dinner. But when dinner time comes, they start making excuses. Every one of them makes an excuse. And Jesus, his final analysis says, they miss out. In other words, if you want to turn down the invitation to dine with God, the character in the story, and if you have something more pressing, more important, or more urgent than enjoying God, that's fine. That's fine, but it's going to cost you. After the service last week, someone came up to me and made this brilliant observation. Stella was saying how, it just struck her that no one kind of went, or all those that got invitations made excuses. And her thought was this, did they just not think it was going to be any good? Did they doubt God's goodness? Perhaps the thing that keeps us from dining with God, the thing that keeps us most from responding to God's invitation, is that we don't think that God is truly all that good. That fits with the whole canon of Scripture where people ignore, neglect, or disobey God. Right from the start in the Garden of Eden through to Revelation, the underlying cause is always a doubt about God's goodness, or a fear that we will even miss out on something else if we are going to spend time with God. Briefly, a recap on last week. Again, for those that were absent or just simply absent-minded, last week we looked at the first excuse, which was a man who had just bought a field. Now, back then, at the time of Jesus, ownership and property was not automatically considered a bad thing because those who owned fields and stuff could share it with others. So this man, having just bought a field, is about to become part of the solution to the problem of poverty. And that's a good thing, right? It's a good thing to have something that you can use to benefit others. It's a good thing until it becomes an excuse. Now, I don't mind what area of ministry or work you're involved in, or what your portfolio looks like, or how much you have to do. Because if you let it become an excuse to spending time enjoying God, being in His presence, then you need to know there is a consequence. It'll be you who will lose out. In fact, much more, it'll be also those that you're trying to help. So, today, we come to excuse number 2. Let me read it to you. Remember, God is inviting you to a party. It is free. It is extravagant. In fact, you could call it, quite literally, heavenly. So Luke 14, jumping in at verse 18. But they all began making excuses. One said he had just bought a field and wanted to inspect it, so he asked to be excused. Another said he had just bought 5 pair of oxen and wanted to try them out. Now you're telling me you don't own any oxen. And I know that, but that's not really the point. You know, today it could be a new tractor or a toy or a trinket. That thing you had on pre-order, that labour-saving device, which oxen were. But regardless of what the thing is, there is a deeper truth behind this man simply just owning a new thing. His excuse is this: he wants to try out his 5 pair of oxen. He wants to put them to work. He wants to be busy. This man's issue is not what he owns. We talked about property and stuff last week. If that is your challenge, you can get a hold of that. But this man's greater distraction, I believe, is the need to be busy doing something, to be trying something out, to be trying to get something, in this case oxen, to work. You see, the labour-saving devices we all enjoy and often take for granted create a false sense of security in some of us. They create an unrealistic expectation of how long things really take, which leads us to just be living life in a rush all of the time. Let me illustrate this. If you use the motorway much, how do you feel when you pull up behind someone who is apparently, in their mind, living life in the fast lane, or even the middle lane, but who is going slower than the speed limit allows? You know, if you're a heavy goods vehicle driver and you get, 40 tons of, bulk up to your, 56 miles an hour, and there's a hill ahead of you and momentum is everything, and then you suddenly find there is a car in the middle lane that's been sitting at 50 miles an hour for 50 miles, it gets in the way. Even if you don't drive, let me explain the rules. You are told in the rule book to use the inside lane unless you're overtaking. And then even if you're overtaking the middle lane, there is one more lane for those people that are still living life in a rush. However, some people live life in the fast lane or the middle lane, not because they are making a pass, but because they have lost a sense of where they should be. Fast lanes are for overtaking. Fast lanes are for brief periods of manoeuvre. Fast lanes are not where you should spend all your time. Which is why living life in the fast lane is a complete myth. We become disillusioned about our place. We think we're a fast mover. But let me tell you this. If you spend all your time in the fast lane, you become a blockage. You become an obstacle. You get in the way. You slow other people down. You burn up more fuel than is necessary. You're forever chopping and changing direction that people close to you don't really know where it is that you're heading. We live in our period of history, and there is a trend which comes as a result of motor vehicles, dishwashers and computers. We expect to squeeze even more out of life, even more out of time. So because we no longer stand at the sink to wash up or walk anywhere, and I know there are 1 or 2 exceptions, because we no longer do things in a way that takes time, we have very low tolerances for space and solitude, which is why for some of us it is so unbearably uncomfortable to stop long enough, to cease to be distracted long enough to go and enjoy all of God's goodness. I mean, if you think about it, many of us are defined by what we do. Not who we are, but what we do, what we get done, what we get working. And this isn't a new idea. The Coopers, they made barrels. And the masons worked with stone. Work is good and normal and healthy, but like owning a field or being in a relationship, when your work or ministry becomes an excuse, when the project or the purchase warrants your attention more than God, then you are in deep, deep water. To set this in context, let me just read you some of the verses which come before Jesus telling this parable, because what's happening here is he's having a meal at the house of a Pharisee, and so the parable we're looking at is just one part of a longer conversation. Jesus is having this meal, and there is a dispute because somewhere around the table or nearby is a man who is lame, who is in need of healing. And Jesus asks the question, because it is the Sabbath day, verse 3, is it lawful to heal him on the Sabbath? But no one will reply. No one's going to be drawn in and commit to a yes or a no. So Jesus asks them, makes it about them. Just 2 verses on, verse 5. If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into the well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out? So you see, oxen are already being talked about before Jesus gets to his parable and excuses. He's already mentioned the idea of ownership and having an animal or an ox. You know, the needs of the lame are being presented. And at this banquet, Jesus is asking this fundamental question is, what should go on if we're here having a banquet and it's about food and nourishment and goodness and healing and health? What should we do with this man? And he then goes on to tell a little parable that precedes the one that we're thinking about. Luke 14, verses 13 to 15. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. When one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God. Which, if you heard the Bible reading, that's the opening line to the parable that we're looking at, is this man's response. Now, Jesus has just told everyone how to hold a banquet. You serve up a feast for those who cannot repay you. You feed those who will never be able to feed you. Now, this is about loving your neighbour. And one man in the crowd picks up on this kind of selfless love and this selfless living and realises it is not ordinary and it is not easy. Perhaps he bought the lame guest. Perhaps even he is the lame guest. We don't know. But what he does understand is that the banquet that Jesus is talking about is how things are done in heaven. And that for those things to be done on earth as in heaven is like just an amazing, amazing concept. And Jesus knows, because of this man's response, that for people to grasp, for you and I to grasp the possibility of things being done on earth as in heaven, for us to throw those kinds of banquets, we need a vision. We need to know how it is in heaven if we're going to try and do it on earth that way. So Jesus tells the parable that we're looking at. He pulls no punches, and he tells how invitations go out, they're not received or they're not responded to, and so eventually at the end of the parable it's the poor and the lonely, the crippled and the lame that get invited in. And that is the context. That is the context. Which, when you understand that, it makes a startling assessment of the excuses. The man that owns the field, the man that wants to put his animals to work, the man that wants to invest more in his relationship. Because the whole point of this banquet that Jesus is describing, what's called the great feast or the great banquet, is that, no one is earning anything. No one is working for it. The invitations have come as an act of grace. And one of the stumbling blocks is when instead of responding and saying, yes, I'll come to your banquet, the excuse is, no, I just need to get this to work. I just need to get this to work. All work, whether it's housework, homework, or other work, paid work or unpaid work, all work has the potential to distract us. And perhaps the most subtle, as I touched on last week, is the work or the service that we find ourselves doing in God's name. And ministry can deceive and distract you like anything else, perhaps more so. You are doing it because God called you to, or because you feel it as a sense of duty. You do it as an expression of loving God and loving your neighbour. All good things. All true, all good. But when we cease to enjoy what God has done for us, when we lose sight of the great feast we're invited to because we're so busy serving others, then we are in peril of missing the point completely. Bear in mind an incident that occurred not long before Jesus is at this meal giving this teaching. This meal is recorded that Jesus is attending, and this parable he tells is recorded in Luke 14. But back in Luke 10, while Jesus was travelling, he's invited out for dinner at someone's home. They're in effect inviting him and his friends who are with him into their house for a kind of banquet, for a feast. Luke 10:38 is where it starts. Let me read it to you. Now, as they, that's Jesus and his friends, as they went on their way, he entered a certain village, where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to him, to Jesus, and asked, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." So Jesus agrees. And when you have Martha moments, Jesus agrees. When you say, "God, I'm so busy," he agrees. Jesus agrees that Martha is distracted. In fact, he even says, "You are worried and distracted by many things." She's invited, but distracted. If you've ever heard me teach on this passage before, you might recall that the word distraction is a Greek word, diakonia, from which some church traditions take the word deacon. It means to minister or to do ministry. Here, Martha is working, slaving, serving, or ministering. I'm assuming her spiritual gift might be hospitality. Martha knew how to serve up a meal, but she didn't seem to know how to savour a meal anymore. She would feed others while spiritually starving herself. And that, if we're truthful, that is what leads to the judgmental, accusatory comments aimed at her sister. You, like Martha, like me, you have a tank from which you serve others. But if you let that run dry, you're going to find yourself saying things similar to what Martha is saying. You will find yourself starting to look at others and judge them and say they're not doing that much. And I love how Jesus will not be drawn in. He completely agrees with her. He completely acknowledges that there is a problem. But the solution is not to blame someone else. He simply says, Mary has chosen the better thing. You might have all sorts of things to try out. All sorts of things to get working. It might be a labour-saving device that you brought. It might be your social networking status. It might be work or ministry. But let me just be unapologetically clear. Nothing, absolutely nothing is more important or in any way better than feeding and feasting from God's banqueting table. And nothing, absolutely nothing will enable and prepare you to reach out and embrace others and invite those who will never invite you. Nothing will enable you to do that more than a deep, sustained connection with God. I would actually argue that it is impossible to genuinely live in a generous, sacrificial way, the way that Jesus describes, where you throw banquets for the lame and the crippled and the blind who can't do the same for you. I think it's impossible to genuinely live that way without abiding with God, which means resting in him, being connected to him, being fueled by him. Think about it with me. If you are going to obey Jesus, which I hope you're at least going to try, and you are going to pour yourself out into those things or those people that have no chance of responding in kind, then either you are going to run out of steam, dry up, burn out, or break down, or, because there is an alternative, or you are going to first tune in, tap into a source of strength that is just unending. Do you understand me? You're either going to just, run out of steam, or you're going to find for yourself a kind of fuel station, a feeding trough, which will just sustain you. But you have to feed first. And let me say this, because it's kind of simple, but often not thought about. It takes more time and discipline and honesty to feed ourselves, to take care of ourselves spiritually, to take care of our soul, than our most energetic ambitions to serve others. I think whatever your area of service, however demanding that might be, it perhaps requires more discipline to do something prior to that that's going to see you connecting with God. Think about the order here. Jesus has just said, this is how to bring heaven to earth. This is how to live life for the benefit of others in a way that may not benefit you, in a way that may bleed you dry. And then he tells the story that we're thinking about. A story to explain what is available to us. If we will take our Heavenly Father up upon the invitation, if we will be invited and not distracted, then we will feast enough to do all that's required of us. I say this often. No one else will take care of your soul for you. No one else can. We can guide and shepherd and provide forms of spiritual nutrition, like we try and do here on Sunday mornings. But you alone decide whether you're actually going to stop long enough to eat and digest in order to sustain yourself. I pray that this week God, will meet you at his banqueting table. The invitation is there. I pray that you will respond to it. Next week, we're going to look at God's greatest gift as we consider the third and possibly the most difficult distraction to intimacy with God, which is relationships. Until then, have a good week.